I was a student at seminary, I used to tell people that my best friend was a dead person. And I said that because when I was in seminary, I took a deep dive into the life and work of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and Vance mentioned that. I spent a lot of time with Bonhoeffer, probably more than any other living human in my life at that time, which doesn't say a lot about my social life or probably my social skills. But I remember sitting in coffee shops, reading about Bonhoeffer's life, reading the words that he wrote and kind of scribbling in the margins. I don't know, maybe some people are like, don't write in books. Sorry. Like, oh my gosh, this is me right now. And there's something audacious about that because, here I am in seminary with a part-time job at a coffee shop in Boston, Massachusetts, and Bonhoeffer's living through World War II in Germany. And so it's kind of a reckless comparison that I was drawing. But I felt this deep kinship to Bonhoeffer. I learned from him. He became a theological hero to me. And the reason he became a theological hero to me is because of, I think the reason he's a theological hero to a lot of people is because of the way he lived his life. The incredible consistency, consonance, and resonance between what he wrote, right, what he professed to believe about God, and the faithful manner in which he lived. I think we're all struggling with that. We're all struggling to find that tension. All right? This is what I believe. This is what I say I believe about God. This is what I say I believe is true. And we're wrestling with what it looks like to embody that forth in our lives. And that's what drew me to Bonhoeffer at first. What made me stay for Bonhoeffer were things that I uncovered about him along the way. There's one particular moment that stays with me to this day. He's in prison in 1944. So a lot of you know something about Bonhoeffer. He is executed by the order of Hitler. It's actually one of Hitler's last execution orders at the end of World War II before he takes his own life. And he's executed for participating in a plot to assassinate Hitler. He's in jail for 3 years before he's executed. And in the middle of that sentence, he finds himself in this moment, this man who wrote the words that we read in Cost of Discipleship, when Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die. He's sitting in prison, contemplating his own impending death and suffering. And he's crumbling in the face of it. All that solidity, all that confidence, the leader that we all know him to be, it wasn't there. We encounter in this moment in July of 1944 a man deeply troubled by his own inconsistencies. When he writes about it, it's almost as if he's acting as an iconoclast. He knows what the Christian world is going to make of him after he dies. And he's saying, this is what's really going on beneath the surface. He writes about how fragile he is, how sinful he is, how fearful he is in the face of suffering and death. And so what we read there creates this disjunct, this dissonance between what we know of him and what he knew about himself. I'll return to Bonhoeffer in a moment, but I want to focus on a question that he asked during this time. It's the title of a poem that he writes, and the title of the poem is, Who Am I? Who am I? And I think in asking this question, Bonhoeffer proves prescient with respect to our current cultural moment. We live in an age and a culture obsessed with identity and authenticity. At a cultural level, Bonhoeffer's question can be answered in any number of ways. That's at a cultural level. At the level of the Christian faith, we know that who Christ is and what he does for us and what he does to us is lay claim to our identities in a decisive and total manner. So what I want to do this morning is just contemplate, reflect on. Again, it's nothing new. We're just trying to remember what Christ makes of us and reflect on that. What makes a Christian response to the question, who am I, unique? I think here of what has become a standard practice in evangelical Christian circles, and that's the practice of testimony. If you've run in Christian circles long enough, you've heard someone give their testimony, or you've been asked to give your own testimony. And I think Christians, when we give our testimony, we understand that we're doing more than just recounting facts about our lives. One of the most famous examples of testimony in church history is Augustine's masterpiece, The Confessions. In it, Augustine, of course, recounts facts about his life, but he does more than that. In the Confessions, he seeks to understand where God is in the midst of those facts. Where was God when Augustine was as a youth, stealing a pear from a tree that didn't belong to him? Where was God when Augustine was praying, Lord, make me holy, but not yet? Where was God when Augustine heard the children in the garden chanting, take and read? And in response, he picks up a Bible and his life is changed forever. Like we see in Augustine's Confessions, Christian testimonies are stories that we tell about our lives with the particular goal of bearing witness to and making sense of God's enduring faithfulness. They give an account of who we are, but they do so by pointing away from ourselves in order to make sense of ourselves. As such, the common Christian practice of testimony points to the fact that a good answer to who am I will reckon with the fact that we are not our own, and that God's faithfulness makes something of us. But what exactly does it mean for God's faithfulness to define us? One way to think about it is to identify what God's faithfulness is not. The faithfulness of God in our lives is not like an Instagram filter. You guys still do filters? Is that a thing you do when you post your Instagram photos? When I was a student here, there was this app. This is going to date me, called Visco Cam, and you would take a picture and you would get it out and you would just toggle around. You make sure you had the perfect filter and setting on your photo, and then you'd post it. And they've got great names like Gingham and Scion. No one knows who named them, but thanks. Anyways, the faithfulness of God is not like an Instagram filter. With these filters, you have the picture, you choose the filter, you can ramp up its intensity, you can alter it, you can make of the picture what you want. God's faithfulness isn't like this. It's not just one optional filter among many through which we can understand our lives. Instead, it's constitutive of who we are as Christians. It shapes our very being. Another thing that God's faithfulness is it's not just the really cool ways that God pops into my life and empowers me to do something or enables me to overcome something I've really been struggling with. That's another way I think we narrate God's faithfulness. Right? We talk about God being faithful in these extraordinary moments. But who is God? God is Emmanuel. Jesus is God for us and with us, which means for God to be faithful, he is faithful always. Not just in the extraordinary moments, but also in the mundane moments, in the moments when life doesn't make sense, and there seems to be no resolution on the horizon. So the manner in which God is faithful to each of us as individuals is grounded in and must be understood in light of how he demonstrates his faithfulness to creation as a whole. I'm talking here, of course, about the person and work of Jesus Christ. In the incarnation, the faithfulness of God is embodied and definitively displayed. It is startlingly good news that a perfectly holy God humbles himself by taking on human flesh. It's such good news. And we're moving into a season where we get to reflect on that. Right? That God enters into human flesh, not just generically, but into particular human flesh. First century Palestinian Jew. He comes that close to us, and he cares that much about us. He suffers to the point of death in order to reconcile human beings to himself. And it's in the very nature of Christ's reconciling work that the faithfulness of God on the one hand and the faith that defines us as Christians meet, and they interlock. See why and how this is, we only need to consider how Paul, in his epistles, draws the closest connection between faith and the person of Christ. We could look here at 2 Corinthians 13:5 or Colossians 2:6-7, but I want to focus on what is my favorite verse, and if you have had a class with me, I've probably talked about it more than once, and that's Galatians 2:20. There Paul writes, I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. We often move too quickly, I think, past this provocative claim. That it's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. We assume that Paul is probably just exercising some rhetorical flourish to just say, Jesus is pretty important in my life. I don't think that's what Paul means. He's making a radical claim here, and I think he knows it. And when we do that, we miss the force of the parallel that Paul is drawing here. First, Paul claims, it's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And then in the very next sentence, he turns around and says, the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God. And scholars have puzzled over this. It's no longer I who live. And then the very next sentence, the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God. Now, Paul is either just blatantly contradicting himself here, and it's hard for me to imagine that that's the case, or he takes these two claims to not only be perfectly consistent, but mutually interpreting. Christ lives in Paul, constituting his very life, and Paul lives by faith in the Son of God. I love that one of the songs we sang this morning bears witness to this fact, that Christ in us is our very life. This tells us something very important about faith. Namely, that Christ's life in us is faith's root and its very possibility. And it's important to stress here, when Paul writes about Jesus, Jesus is not a doctrine for Paul. He's not just a package of beliefs that we have about some idea we call Jesus. Jesus is a person. A person who had a body, who has a body, and is seated at the right hand of the Father. And that so when Paul claims that Jesus is definitive for who I am, he's saying this person who stands over against me and lays claim to me and binds myself to him, this person defines who I am. If Jesus is an idea, then we can make Jesus be whoever we want to be. We can make him affirm whatever we want him to affirm about ourselves and our ambitions and our desires. But if Jesus is a person, you can't make people be anything other than who they are. You can't make Jesus be anything other than who he is. And so when we hear Paul say, it's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me, that's a demanding claim. And so if we accept that Christ dwelling in us is the wellspring of our faith and set this reality alongside of an understanding of Christ as the faithfulness of God, it becomes clear that the faithfulness of God is not one interpretive filter alongside of many that we can apply to our lives. Jesus just is God's faithfulness to us, and apart from him, the faith that defines us, it's impossible. And God, in his faithfulness through the person of Christ, makes something of us. This, I think, is helpful to keep in mind when we turn finally to the passage that Will read for us this morning from Hebrews 11. Now, I love Hebrews 11. And Hebrews 11 oftentimes is referred to as the Hall of Faith. And, Hall of Faith is a riff on Hall of Fame, of course. And I was working on this chapel talk, and I was looking up, and I was just curious what we have Hall of Fames for in America, and we have a lot. There's a roller derby Hall of Fame, a curling Hall of Fame, a candy Hall of Fame. There's also an internet Hall of Fame. I'm curious what you have to do. Like, what's the criteria for being inducted into the internet Hall of Fame? Like, if you're really good at finding cat memes, does that qualify? I don't know. Maybe I'll submit myself. There's lots of Hall of Fames. It's great. I love Wikipedia sites that give you lists of stuff. On the Wikipedia site about conspiracy theories is pretty fascinating as well. But what they all have in common, what all these halls of fame have in common, is that what is required for admittance into them is excellence. It's being exemplary at your performance in the category that the Hall of Fame is for. It's being the best of the best. And this makes me think that if we take that sort of Hall of Fame logic, and then we think about Hebrews 11 as a Hall of Faith, and we think about it in terms of these people being the best of the best, this passage doesn't actually make very much sense. Right? Because when we read Hebrews 11, we encounter a bunch of figures. We've got Moses, and Moses has got his flaws, but fair enough. He does some pretty cool stuff. Rahab, she's got a shady moral past, but she comes through for Israel's spies and even gets named in Jesus' genealogy, so it makes sense. But then you get like Gideon and Samson. If you read these guys' narratives in the Old Testament, Gideon and Samson are not like super impressive guys. They kind of do one-off great things for God. Otherwise, they're kind of meh. When it comes to faith, I wouldn't call Gideon and Samson the best of the best. It would be like taking Nick Foles and putting him in the Football Hall of Fame because he won a Super Bowl. All right? Yeah, sports reference, there it is. My point here is not to say that the author of the book of Hebrews makes a major misstep by including Gideon and Samson in this chapter. I don't even really care if we call it the Hall of Faith or not. But I think we need to get clear on what sort of criteria we're using when it comes to induction. All right? What kind of criteria does faith entail when it comes to understanding what a faithful life looks like? And I think Hebrews 11 gives us some criteria for doing that. And I want to think about that in relation to what I just talked about with Paul in Galatians. The first verse of Hebrews 11, which we didn't read, says, faith is the confidence in what we hope for, and assurance about what we do not see. On the surface, this verse seems to imply that faith is fundamentally a psychological category, a sense of deep confidence in the promises of God and assurance that they will come to pass. However, if we look deeper, there's more going on here. The Greek word that the NIV translates as confidence is hypostasis. And hypostasis can be translated as confidence, but it can also be translated as essence, substance, or reality. And the verse reads a little bit differently if you render it in that way. Faith is the reality of what we hope for, and assurance about what we do not see. Faith is the reality. I don't have I don't have the credentials to come down on which translation is the best. My New Testament colleagues could do that for me. But I simply point that out to say, hypostasis here, faith being the reality or the confidence in things hoped for, seems to be referring to much more than a psychological state. Instead, it implies that there's an intimate connection between faith and what is hoped for. Or perhaps even that the things hoped for somehow are present to us in faith. We can flesh this out by moving backwards into chapter 10. In chapter 10, the author of Hebrews is working out the nature of Christ's perfect once and for all sacrifice. And he says, since Jesus has shed his blood for us, since we can come near to God through the curtain, which is Jesus' flesh, because of those things, we can have faith. And so because of Jesus' work, because of the way that it's present to us in faith, because of the decisive nature of it for who we are, we have to read what it means to be faithful for people like Samson and Gideon and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob in that light. And it changes the way we read this chapter, because it's no longer a bunch of people who did awesome stuff for God. It's a bunch of broken, fundamentally flawed people who God continued to be faithful to. The passage that Will read was about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And I love thinking about these three, because when Moses meets God at the burning bush and God introduces himself to Moses and he gives him his name, he says, I'm Yahweh, I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He associates himself with them that intimately. But go back and read Genesis. These patriarchs are three very different people, and they have three very different types of faith journeys. Abraham makes some missteps, but he kind of is represented as a great man of faith. Isaac, there's barely anything about him at all. He's mostly passive. Someone's getting a wife for him, or he's about to get sacrificed, or he's being tricked by his wife and his sons. Jacob lies, cheats, and wrestles with God. And we look at these three different ways in which their lives unfold. And then we flip to Hebrews and we see God say, these are the people who held on to the promises. These are the people who are faithful. This pushes back on our tendency to imagine, and it's easy to do in contexts like we are in here at Taylor, that the faithful life looks one sort of way. But we begin to think that because we forget that the faithful life is determined by who God is for us and not by what we do. God is faithful to Jacob, who wrestles. He's faithful to Isaac, who's pretty mundane. And he's faithful to Abraham, who is faithful in great ways. Now, I think this all has bearing on how we answer the question, who am I? Because the answer that I've given to that question is the Sunday school answer. It's Jesus. Jesus is definitive for who we are. And this is really good news for us because it takes the weight of self-definition from our shoulders. Realizing this for some of us is going to be painful. We're proud of who we are and what we've made of ourselves, and our instinctive response to the question we've been considering, who am I, is to give an account of our accomplishments. For others, Jesus' gracious definition of us in faith is the greatest relief. We've tried on identity after identity, and none seem to fit or solve our restlessness. We know that we cannot make something of ourselves. We despair that our faith is a facade. Circling back to Bonhoeffer, he fell into the latter camp. In the poem I referenced earlier, after outlining the tension he felt between outward calm and confidence in his inner turmoil, he wonders which one is the real Bonhoeffer. And he concludes with the following testimony. "Who am I?" he writes. "Who am I? They mock me, these lonely questions of mine. Whoever I am, thou knowest, O God, I am thine. Whoever I am, thou knowest, O God, I am thine." We all find ourselves in different places, being encountered by God in different ways and at different moments in our journey along the path of faith. But whether you're at the beginning and you know yourself as a ball of contradictions, or at the end and you know yourself as a ball of contradictions, who you are remains the same. Thou knowest, O God, I am thine. And when this happens, when we're fearful in the face of our contradictions, when we seek to compensate by making much of ourselves, we can be encouraged by folks like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And their different ways of living out the faithful life. And with them and through them, we can remember what makes us worthy. What defines our faith and governs our narrative is not what we do or fail to do, but what God makes of us in Christ. Whoever I am, thou knowest, O God, I am thine. I went late. We're done. Jesus, thank you for your love for us. You are dismissed.